Welcome back to another episode of the Loco Fit Show, where we redefine what healthy means to you. I'm your host, Lauren Conlon, and this week I'm joined by Cliff Harvey. I am so excited for this interview, you guys, because I met Cliff in Australia. This year we were presenting at the Sports Nutrition Association conference and kind of just immediately hit it off, right? And obviously you're incredibly smart. And I mean, everybody on the board is, right? But we just had some really great conversations, and you have a very interesting perspective on things and really just bring it back to the client and the nuance. And I just absolutely love that because a lot of times, especially people who have a big background in like research and different things, can sometimes get like lost in that, I feel like, and they forget the individual. So before we get into things, because I know we're going to be going all over the place today. I don't even have a working title yet because I'm like, I know we're going to dive into so much fun stuff, but give a little background on your background for the listeners.
Okay, well, probably like a lot of people listening in, I started out as a strength coach and personal trainer. Having said that, though, I didn't initially want to do that. I wanted to be a landscape designer, designing sort of Zen-inspired gardens and doing bonsai and stuff like that.
That so
But
checks out.
yeah, so a couple of years, oh, no, sorry, the year before my final year of high school, the coaches of our first 15 rugby team. So, New Zealand rugby is a big deal. It's a national sport. It's, practically a religion. And high school rugby, apart from when people go on to basically be, in that sort of pro system, that's kind of probably our equivalent of like college football for you guys is high school first 15. And so the coaches of the first 15 came to me and said, you're too small to play first 15 rugby. But if you can put on X amount of size, you'll captain the team. It's like, okay, cool. So I went down to the library because this is back in the 90s, right? Went down to the library, got out textbooks on nutrition, strength training, started learning all I could about it. Probably put on close to 20 kilos in a year. And from there, I was just fascinated with the way the human body works, strength training and in particular nutrition to support that. And so rather than going off the landscape design route, it didn't help that I got kicked out of high school following the rugby season. But after that, I went off and instead studied strength training, fitness training, became through that a strength coach and nutrition coach, but then sort of diversified and really wanted to learn more about the whole sort of mind body or psychoneurophysiology side of things. So I learned a lot through the years of various mind body modalities, circled back through postgrad in mind body healthcare to nutrition, and ended up doing my master's and PhD in nutrition with a specialization in ketosis ketogenesis, but with a bigger picture of what I call that carb appropriate spectrum. And that carb appropriate spectrum is really looking at the best dietary fit for the individual. And so that covers the spectrum from, it's really trying to dispel the needless debate between high carb and low carb. Because I think so much of the debate there is just completely redundant. And so that's really my educational journey and practice journey to this point. I've been doing this now for 27 odd years. So a little while. I started off in the days when Celine Dion was topping the airwaves and the Bulls were finishing their second three-peat. So it's been a little while on feet now.
Well, and I think it's great because you've seen a lot of different iterations of this space, right? Not just, research and academia, but also just what people are interested in, with your company, Holistic Performance Institute, and just really everything, right, that's evolved over the past, 27 years. So with your research in ketogenic diets, or we'll just say carb appropriate diets, what are some of the things, one, that you found really useful in terms of from like a coaching perspective, but then also conceptualizing that, then versus like now, right? Like, where have you seen any differences? Or are people different? Are lifestyles different, right? Because back then, like, life was just different for a lot of people, and the lack of information was a lot greater. But now we're also inundated with so much information that I feel like it can also be harmful. So I guess just speak to that kind of broadly.
Yeah, and that's a big question, right? Because when I got into it, and I was talking about this with Joe, Dr. Joe at the
Mm-hmm.
conference. He came into the industry a little bit before me, but it was probably 5 or 10 years before. So we were both around that sort of explosion in the 90s where we had Muscle Media and we had, all those authors that came out of that started to sort of achieve some prominence. But one thing that was really interesting back in those days is that there was a lot of bro science, and now we sort of deride that. And I'm very derisive of bro science because a lot of times it's not helpful. But we also need to remember that a lot of these people were, in some sense, scientists because they were self-experimenting, creating hypotheses, testing it on themselves and their clients, and that kickstarted a lot of what we now do. It was one of the reasons, not why I got kicked out of high school, obviously, that was for a whole different reason, but one of the reasons I got kicked out of university was because I was questioning the prevailing dogma of high carb at all costs. And I didn't arrive at that because I was a low carb zealot, because there weren't really low carb zealots at that point. There were a few, maybe early adopters of Atkins, people who were following Dan Duchaine's Body Opus, which was amazing in itself because it, was creating all these hypotheses. But it came about through an inductive process where I was starting to design nutrition plans for athletes. And we were told that you had to prescribe 65% calories from carbohydrate. And then you kind of figure out the fat and the protein after that. And I sort of thought, hold on, that doesn't really make sense because we've learned that there are essential amino acids and there is some level of threshold of protein. There is some level of threshold of fat that we need to achieve to provide essential fatty acids, but also to preserve hormonal balance and help prevent risk of overtraining and things like that. And so because of the essentiality of those nutrients, I sort of thought, well, why are we allocating carbohydrate first? Surely it makes more sense, especially as I was reading all the early research from the now famous protein researchers, right? Wouldn't it make more sense to allocate protein first and then, maybe start with a minimum threshold of fat and then see what was left for carbohydrate, because carbohydrate is not essential per se, it's conditionally essential. So, I'm not a low carb zealot saying you don't need to eat carbs. What I'm saying is that carbs pretty much just provide fuel in the body, and therefore someone's overall energy allotment should dictate how much carbohydrate they have after protein and fat is allocated. Now, interestingly, we fast forward 25 plus years, and that is pretty much the standard way that people develop macros, right? They set protein first, and then they allocate somehow carbohydrate and fat. So it's interesting because we started off from that sort of place, and a lot of the bro science was helping to push things in a different direction, which has now ended up being sort of science, right? And so I've completely forgotten what your question was, but this is really the genesis
No,
of
that's
how
great.
that all started. And one of the things, I remember your question now, one of the things that really became clear as I started doing postgrad research was how little we knew. And a really good example of that was, I'm going to nerd out a little bit here. I apologize to any listeners who don't really care about this, but we have this idea of nutritional ketosis, right, as being anything greater than 0.5 millimoles per liter of beta hydroxybutyrate. So in other words, 0.5 millimoles per liter of this key ketone in the blood. And so when we started getting into the research, one of the first projects I did was looking at how we could induce ketosis faster, more effectively, with fewer side effects. And I realized a couple of things. That number was very arbitrary. There wasn't really any research backing it. And so I asked Stephen Finney, who was one of the early researchers in ketosis and ketogenic diets, how did you and Jeff Volek sort of come to this number? And he said, well, that's kind of where we saw people starting to improve, feeling better. So it was quite qualitative. And so it was really interesting because this was a thing that in clinical nutrition and performance nutrition, we'd kind of considered was set in stone, but it was actually quite arbitrary. So our research helped to, in some respect, solidify that number, but also show that it was quite arbitrary in other ways. Another aspect or another example of that was really just how little we knew about the functional effects of the induction of ketosis, right? So we really did some of the first research which properly looked at and quantified these symptoms of keto induction, which people call keto flu. Now, I constantly email other researchers saying, hey, have you even read this study, this paper that we put out several years ago, or quite a few years ago now? Because it showed that, for example, keto flu is not limited to ketogenic diets. It's a function really of any drastic restriction in carbohydrates. So we see it on moderate, low, keto, whatever. And so calling it keto flu is a bit of a misnomer. Anyway, those are just some examples of how little we knew and how much we need to continue to research. But to bring it full circle back to sort of a conclusion to your question, the biggest outcome that I saw was that we have some indications that there are markers that can tell us with some certainty, I guess, which type of diet someone should be on. And we have some clinical conditions for which there are probably better diets. But overall, if we look at a generally healthy diet that's nutrient replete, that has enough protein, that has enough essential fatty acids, the effect size or the difference in the effect size between those diets is really freaking small, right? Especially if people are able to sustain a diet for a year, 2 years, 3 years kind of thing. And so that brings it back to the psychosocial elements being so important. Because, for example, if I have a client who would probably benefit most from a low carb diet, but they hate it, and maybe they're of South Asian descent, they're culturally and in their familial environment are much more predisposed to be eating rice and things like that, then we can do that. We can still get great results within their culturally appropriate, their familially appropriate framework, and something that's better for their psychosocial and psycho-emotional milieu. So that was really one of the biggest things that I didn't learn that through the research because I already kind of suspected that and applied that in clinical practice, but it really helped to confirm that there's not that much difference between diets, assuming they're overall fairly healthy. And that's why I said earlier, I think a lot of the debate between, high carb, low carb, low carb's going to kill you, high carb's going to kill you because of, I don't know, sugar, whatever. It's all kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, can you speak to maybe some of those things that you saw or some of the reasons why someone would respond better to a lower carb diet versus not? Because I have my things that I've seen with individuals, but I'm curious what you've seen. And this doesn't even have to be research. This can just be like from, working with clients and patients. I'm just kind of
Yeah.
curious there.
Well, I think clinically, there are some specific advantageous states for certain conditions. So for example, and this is, some of this is emerging research and some of it is still somewhat hypothetical, but there are particular benefits for maybe concussion prophylaxis. There are particular benefits for neurodegenerative disorders because of improved fueling in the brain, reduced glutamate excitotoxicity, improved levels of adenosine, maybe even microglial aspects where there's better lymphatic drainage and all sorts of stuff going on in the brain, right? So there are potential benefits to some aspects of brain health. There are potential benefits, or there are known benefits for seizure disorders like epilepsy. So those are very clear. There are other ones that are fairly clear, but there's a lot of nuance there, like with diabetes treatment, low carb. Typically, not typically. The research is pretty clear that low carb reduces HbA1c or those average blood glucose levels much more effectively than higher carb diets. I've certainly seen in clinical practice, and I've presented this at a number of medical conferences, that where people have very high triglyceride levels, and we actually did some research on this. It was that our findings weren't strong, but we still have a strong suspicion that the higher the triglyceride levels in the blood, the greater the calorie restriction to improve that. Now, again, it's not set in stone because that person could still get really good results from a high carb diet, but they're probably going to reduce triglycerides far quicker and more effectively through a low carb diet. On the other hand, we would see particular benefits for fueling if people, are performing a lot of high intensity training, so large volumes of high intensity training. Obviously, they're going to benefit from increased carbohydrate. Does that mean they need to be on a high carb diet per se? Not necessarily, because there are some people who are on low carb, but their low carb looks very different to someone else's low carb. This is why we can't be arbitrary with our definitions either. Big problem in low carb research is that people have arbitrary definitions. So you'll have a lot of researchers who will sort of say, well, a low carb or keto diet is under 50 grams of carbs per day. I'm sort of saying, well, you can achieve ketosis on, we've demonstrated this, on 15% of your calories from carbohydrate, or even some people up to 25% of their calories from carbohydrate. So let's say you're one of those outliers and you can achieve ketosis on 25% calories from carbohydrate, and your total daily energy intake should be about 4,000 calories because you're pretty active. It's 250 grams of carbs, right? It's quite a lot. And I've done a self-experiment on that, which a lot of low-carb researchers didn't believe, where I was backloading carbohydrate to the amount of about 200 or 250 grams straight after dinner, setting cornflakes, right? And I'd be back in ketosis by 11 a.m. the next morning. Pretty cool, right? So there are obviously areas in which low carb can be effective clinically. One of the biggest benefits from low carb or any of those, what I call sort of dietary levers, is it helps to auto-regulate energy. And so typically we see, not always, if you're shoving sticks of butter into your coffee, you may not experience this because you're just going to be calorie overloaded. But for most people, a keto diet is very satiating, and so it drives energy intake down, as does fasting, right? And so those sorts of methods can be really useful if someone tends to be a habitual overeater, and if that method works for them psychosocially. On the other hand, there's nothing magical about those interventions. People who think they have to fast because of some sort of autophagic wizardry, they're probably barking up the wrong tree, right? Especially, as I've seen a lot in clinical practice, if they tend to be a habitual undereater. Because then you go for those dietary levers that drive your energy intake further down, you might end up with some severe problems, right? So in those cases, it might be better to have the dietary levers that really push their energy intake up, like eating more frequently. Maybe even if they're eating a really high protein diet, maybe dropping the protein a little bit so they're not so satiated. Maybe increase the carbs, because carbs to a point don't really seem to be as satiating unless they're very high fiber varieties. So, there's always different interventions that can work for the individual. And that's why, as coaches, because I consider us all coaches. I don't care if you're a PhD nutritionist or you're a health coach, you're a sports nutritionist. You're at the basis a coach, because you're working with people. If you're not doing that, if you're not coaching, you'll be out of a job in 5 years because AI is going to do it for you, right? So we're all coaches. And as coaches, we need to be immediately moving from, now, Eric and I have talked about this a lot at workshops. We need to move immediately from best practice to best for the individual.
Absolutely. And I love, love, love that you said that, because I think that these conversations get so heated unnecessarily, because it's like, why are we planting our flag somewhere that it really doesn't matter, right? Like, does this work for the individual or not? And I've seen clients who, quote unquote, would be on keto, right? For them, they're very active. They can eat enough protein. They can eat kind of what some people would consider high protein, and they're still feeling the positive effects of ketosis to them, right? And again, like, what does that mean? Now, this person is not, again, asterisk, I'm not working with anybody who has epilepsy, something like that, right? Like, no situations in that way. But there's been other people who can eat higher carbs and still be, like, to your point, in ketosis. So I think that the arbitrary definitions that we have for things are really not useful. But I also really loved how you spoke about fasting and different protocols like that, or even just lower carb, because when you think about lower carb, most people, they're taking away the foods that are just highly palatable. So they're taking away high carb and high fat foods, right? Like, in terms of like the junk food. So when you have this in your mind, I'm not going to eat this, it's just way easier. There's less choices. Like, this is why it's working for a lot of people. And for certain individuals, I've found, and again, this is a very broad stroke, it's not always correct, but I find that more men like higher fat foods, not always, but generally speaking, in my experience, a lot of men prefer like higher fat, higher protein type foods. Like there's just certain things like I would really struggle on a keto diet for the amount of calories that I eat in my output, just because
Yeah,
I don't like those kinds of foods all the time. But there are some people who are like, no, like that's my jam. Like if I had to sit down and say, what do I want to eat? Like it's that. So that really speaks to that psychosocial aspect because, we have to, and that is my huge gripe with just quote unquote evidence based, right? And it's like, okay, yes, there's a study or there's a multitude of studies that maybe point in one direction, but is your client like not even able to stick to that for 3 weeks? Like, who fucking cares what study or what systematic review showed? You know what I mean? Like, we have to make it work for them. And like, how can we get them closer to what is potentially optimal, but like who really knows what that is, and like no, none of us do. So I think that it's so
yeah,
important to always look at yourself as a coach, and that is where I think that some of the bro science has got it right, because it's like, all right, let's really look at these things and let's experiment and be okay with that, like that self experimentation, versus I feel like a lot of times science can get so in its own way because it's like there's
yeah.
nothing else to show this and we can't do that. It's like, why? Like
Well, people, even people who claim to be evidence-based are very quick to try and find that gotcha. And, a good example of that is I still believe, based on the evidence, that there is likely to be some effect of insulin homeostasis. So insulin resistance versus sensitivity on which diet is going to be best, in inverted commas, for
Mhm.
somebody. But when I say that, people say diet fits. The diet fit study, the biggest, most well-funded study in that area, showed there was no effect. It's like, okay, fair. But if you look into the nuance of the study, it wasn't really, it didn't end up really giving us the answers we wanted because the difference in the diets was very minimal. We were looking at people who were overall healthy. They excluded people who were insulin resistant. And so there are a number of confounding influences there, but it's not to discredit that study. That was a great study and it really added to the evidence and it helped to shift a lot of perspective because the sort of four previous studies, which were a lot smaller, had all sort of pointed in the direction of insulin resistance being really important. But here's an interesting thing. A lot of people in the low carb space in particular, the real zealots, will point to those studies and say, look, low carb works better for fat loss and stuff like that. But what they're purposefully leaving out is that the insulin sensitive people in those previous studies actually did better on a high carb diet. So that shows that there was that individual variability. But here's the bigger thing, I think. Everybody lost weight, right? Everybody lost fat, irrespective of the diet. And the difference was big enough, but not that big. So again, it goes back to that point of what is going to work for the individual. And so I think, despite our best efforts, those of us, I think, who are more nuanced or pragmatic, and I hope I'm one of them, will try and get out of our own way, but we're still going to be biased. If people aren't trying to get out of their own way, they're going to be really biased. And we see that with the misinterpretation of research all the time. Great example, again, is observational research. Trends towards, not always, it's very equivocal, but it trends towards showing that lower carb diets are associated with increased mortality risk. But you can't see that from an observational study because a lower carb diet means those consuming the fewest carbohydrate across the population ends up usually being about 40 odd percent carbohydrate. And when you look into, again, the nuance there, it's likely to be because, they're choosing, like you mentioned, males often choose higher fat foods. But if they're not choosing higher fat, sort of healthy or sort of low carb foods, the higher fat foods are likely to be pizza, burger, things like that. At the other end of the spectrum, you also see people who consume very high carb diets also have poor mortality outcomes. Why? Because they're the ones who tend to not choose those foods. They choose lollies, soft drink, those types of foods. So what are we actually looking at here? We're looking at diets that are not overall healthy. And so when people say moderation's best, it's like, well, yes and no. It's just healthy's best, right? And the rest doesn't matter too much. It really grinds my gears when people say that women shouldn't fast or women shouldn't do low carb or women shouldn't do high intensity interval training. And I'm speaking out of turn here because I'm a male. Like I was born biologically male and I identify as a male. So I've got all of that here. But I personally think that it's very disempowering to have those sorts of messages out there for women because there are a lot of women for whom it works really well. And it's more about how is anyone, going to achieve an appropriate energy balance and be nutrient replete and be able to sustain that. And for some people, fasting works. And for others, it's not very good. And for some people, low carb is awesome. And for others, it doesn't work that well. A lot of the studies that I think people are citing to support those ideas as well, they're misinterpreting.
I'm so glad you brought that up because it is quite the bane of my existence. When people basically make it seem like, first of all, yes, there are absolutely differences between men and women, undoubtedly, right? But they are not so stark that like women are these delicate flowers who can't do anything outside of 1 week a month. Like you got one hard training week and then you just have to do, you know, deep breathing yoga and make sure you're eating all the carbs and just frolicking in a forest and like come on guys, like hey, this, to your point, is disempowering, right? If that's how you want to live your life, I am so here for it, right? Like there's nothing against that. However, that doesn't mean that other people shouldn't, if they, want to do fasting, if they want to train really hard, that's where you have to auto-regulate things and look at your own biofeedback to see how you're responding. And that's where it takes a little bit of the individual to say, okay, I need to look at this information, but kind of silence that noise and really just look at my own self as this N of one. And then also, if you are working with a coach, really communicating that with them, because I think what this is just social media has made it to where people want to make a name, they want to be flashy. So they'll say these things like, if you're fasting, you're raising your cortisol, and cortisol is why you're fat. And it's like, how did we like what like there are so many other things here, you know what I mean? Like we're not going to sit here and say that high cortisol is a good thing, right? But like chronically elevated cortisol, probably not the best thing for your body. But fasting within the context of a healthy, nutrient sufficient diet where you are training hard and recovering and sleeping, like this is not going to just crash your body. And it's people are trying to oversimplify complicated
Yeah.
things. And it's so disempowering because then the person who maybe was finally like just getting into like weight training and like, eating better and finally found something to like stop their overeating. And they're like, yeah, I really like this fasting protocol, 16-8, like it's great. Now they're like, wait, what? Do I have to go back to this thing? And then, that's not taking into consideration any of their experiences. And that's just stepping them all the way back. And that is just, oh, so frustrating. There's the cortisol boom. I don't know if you've seen this on social media, but there's like everything comes in these weird cycles, you know what I mean? And
Mhm.
you would think that if you have a cup of coffee and skip breakfast that, all of a sudden your cortisol is going to be 50 and you're going to have a puffy face and like you're just like, my God, you guys, it is not that
Well,
easy.
I wrote an article on that because I was getting so annoyed with it. So I reviewed all the research, and notwithstanding that these transient increases in cortisol don't really matter anyway. But if what people don't realize is that the doses that are used in caffeine research are really high. Like generally, it's 6 milligrams per kilo, right? So I'm a 90-kilo man. That's just a touch under 200 pounds for you guys. So six 6 grams, 6 milligrams per kilo, 540 milligrams. That's 5.5 cups of strong coffee. That's a lot of coffee, right? I'm not going to chug down 5.5 cups of coffee first thing in the morning. Now, interestingly, when researchers looked at the lower dose, which is typically in research around 3 milligrams per kilo, there's not really any appreciable effect on cortisol. Another interesting piece of research is that probably if you've been underslept the previous night, like I was last night with a baby who was up all night, that caffeine can actually reduce the cortisol spike. It's got a modulatory effect. So it's very context dependent, but it points to the idea that so much of what's out there that people take on board as science is really just fear-based marketing. And in some cases, it's coming from, in a lot of cases, it's coming from people who are ostensibly scientists. Some of the supposed, world-leading experts in women's health are some of the biggest promoters of fear-based pseudoscience. Others like, the Hubermans and whatnot are really jumping the shark into the deep end of pseudoscience. And it's not helpful, but it's very difficult to make a name with pragmatism. Because pragmatism is not controversial, right? No one actually wants to talk about, oh yeah, I guess there is some nuance there, and I guess different things do work for different people. And I guess the evidence does show this. It's boring, right? It's not like your hormones are going to be screwed if you fast and drink coffee in the morning and do high intensity interval training. So buy my book.
It was like, even when, at the event that we did, right? And we had the second day we had several I think it's called them round table discussions, right? And one of them we were, posited it like in terms of like, Dr. Joe's like, team tracking and like metrics. And then we tried to put it to where like Mac and Josh were like, don't do that, we're anti-tracking. But the hilarious part of all of this was that like they agreed on probably like 90% stuff. But that just goes to show, again, how like they're all actual true practitioners. You know what I mean? Like they maybe have their own types of clients. Like Joe has certain clients, Mac has certain clients, Josh has certain clients. Like that's just who is coming into their ecosystem. So you start to see those things over and over again, but all of them know that they can't just overlay those things to every person. That's just like, that's who they're working with. And it was just really interesting how it started as like a let's put these things against each other, and not, but it was just hilarious how it was like they pretty much all agree and were like, this is a good point, I like this, yeah, what about the
Yeah.
it was
I
just this.
remember quite a few years ago, because Eric Helms is obviously one of my best mates. And we were invited on a podcast to debate, like high carb versus low carb. So it's like Cliff, the low carb researcher, versus Dr. Eric Helms. And the podcast was just basically like, yep, he's right. There's a time and a place for this, and this is how we do things. And it was just very incredibly collegial. It wouldn't have been. I mean, it was a good podcast, but it certainly wasn't the debate it was hashed up to be.
Yeah, no, and that's always, I think that again just speaks to like that's to me like the true scientific spirit, right? But we've kind of touched on this a few different ways, but talk about just kind of nutrient insufficiency. And I know that's something that you talk about pretty frequently and are very interested in. And I think that speaks to, again, regardless of the type of diet that you're choosing to be on, being healthy is number one, right? And having enough nutrients and choosing certain types of, foods or products or whatever it might be. So just kind of speak to that. And I guess really, where are you seeing the biggest holes in people's dietary choices or programs?
Yeah, firstly, I think that the research is not always particularly well designed to show us the true prevalence of particularly micronutrient insufficiency. And that's because, it relies on food recall or food frequency questionnaires. People aren't always reporting well. We know that. The analysis is not always particularly accurate. And for some things, I'm not one of those people who's like, all the reference ranges suck, because most of the reference ranges are really good. But for some of the reference ranges, we would probably say they're not always entirely appropriate for overall health. They might have very specific disease outcomes. We're really looking at frank deficiency in a lot of cases, right? So because of that, I don't think the research really shows us the true prevalence of micronutrient insufficiency. But even the research that we do have from the States, from Australia, from New Zealand, does show that a large proportion, probably most people, are not getting enough of at least one essential vitamin or mineral each and every day, right? Now, that's worrying to me, because the importance is in the name. It's essential. And if we don't have something that's essential, the body has to make compromises. And so we see, very strong associations between insufficiencies of, key nutrients and immunological problems, autoimmune conditions, COVID, long COVID, etc. And so I think it's basically, to my mind, a sort of hidden epidemic that not enough people talk about. And when people do talk about it, it's kind of put aside as quackery. People say, because the party line is generally just eat a healthy diet and you'll get all you need. I think it's a little bit more difficult than that, particularly in our modern food environment. And when we consider that there are a lot of people who taking a lot of energy, but maybe it's not from the most nutrient dense sources, there's a high potential there that they're not going to get everything they need. When we also consider there's probably an underestimated number of people in the general population who are suffering from a relative energy deficiency, which enhances the likelihood of nutrient insufficiency for the micronutrients, that's also a challenge. And so a lot of my sort of recent research has not been conducting trials and things. It's been looking at smaller cohorts, people with COVID, long COVID, looking at the associations between vaccine adverse events and nutrition. I'm a big fan of vaccines, just so people know. I'm not an anti-vaxxer in any sense at all, but there are a very, very small minority of people who do experience adverse events. And my suspicion is that that might have an association with their micronutrient sufficiency, because those nutrients are so critical for immune function, in the same way that they're critical for helping us to be more resilient in the face of a virus. Similar sort of thing. And so interestingly, in our clinical practice, we quite often analyze people's diets, right? So we're trying to get a little bit more granular on it, looking at their intakes of vitamins and minerals. And in the last 10 years or so, can you guess how many people we've seen who were nutrient sufficient?
Probably none.
Just one. One
Wow.
athlete came through who was reaching sufficiency for everything. Every other person we've analyzed was not, we can't say deficient or even insufficient endogenously. What we can say is their intakes were insufficient according to those sort of reference ranges. And so, I think it's an underestimated component of our long-term health and performance. And so I really think that we need to refocus on that. And it sort of helps to cut through a lot of the BS around these arguments, because I think people should be more focused on eating a diet that is overall healthier, that is nutrient replete, that has as much variety as they can do easily while making it sustainable. Because I think variety for variety's sake typically leads people to fall off the wagon. But, taking care of all those things first, I do think people should take a multi just for, that extra support. And I think if we can focus on some of those key things first, that's much more important than whether someone is arbitrarily high carb, low carb, carnivore, vegan, whatever.
Mm-hmm. No, that's so interesting. That's such an interesting tie in terms of, autoimmunity and just immunity in general with being sick and the long COVID and all of that. And I there's just the argument, because I understand the argument of, hey, just have people eat better food. Okay, it's like, have you looked at people's diet logs? You know what I mean? Like, this just sounds like a utopia to be like, yeah, everybody should just eat better foods. And it's like, okay, again, the variety. I always try to tell clients this whenever I'm talking about whether it's a multi or a greens product or something like that, right? Because those often get very vilified by certain people, right? Like, they get overhyped by certain individuals and then vilified by others.
Yeah.
And I think it should be looked at for what it does, and it provides nutrients that you're most likely not getting. And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't seek to have fruits and vegetables in your diet, because there's obviously way different compounds in those things. But again, looking at the reality of most people's lives in terms of their schedules, in terms of what they even like eating, right? Like, there's only so many vegetables that I'm going to go to the store and make. Like, it's just this just is, right? And so
Yeah.
I know that I'm only going to be getting certain profiles of things, and I can, yeah, switch things up for variety's sake, but there is reality too that we have to be rooted in. And so I get really aggravated when I see those comments, because it just feels really short-sighted, and it just feels like they're not taking the actual client into consideration. Because I'm like, yeah, it's one of those things that like sounds great, but in practice, much more challenging to work with individuals to cover those bases without something like a supplement. And I think that
Yeah.
again, they always seem to like go in these swings in terms of like people are either like so diehard about certain supplements, but then other people are so anti them. And it's like there has to be there again, most likely there's this middle ground. And especially if someone is in a calorie deficit, whether they are just dieting or if they're, doing something like a weight cut or physique competition, like if we're talking about physique athletes, they could be dieting 6 to 8 months out of a year. Like they don't have enough nutrients, right? Like
Yeah.
we need to refill this somewhere.
100%. I saw a comment online, sort of self-proclaimed fitness expert saying if you're relying on supplements to get all that you need, you know, from your nutrition, you're doing it wrong. I was like, I get what he was saying, but I replied and said, hold on, but let's say someone consistently undereats their protein target by 20 grams, and the easiest thing to do is chuck in a scoop of protein because habitually they've tried and failed trying to change other things, and they know they can do that each and every day. Surely that's a good intervention, because I think the simpler it can be, the more sustainable it's going to be. I know from experience that when I don't take a multi daily, I tend to be a little bit under on some nutrients,
Mhm.
right? I'm a nutritionist. I've been doing this for a long time. I should be able to get all I can from nutrition, and I probably could, but it's just easier at times to have that nutritional support. And as I said to a couple of the SNA guys who had posted that, sort out your diet first before supplementing. I said, hold on, why do you need to make sure your diet's perfect before you supplement? Because if you're not nutrient replete now, you may not be nutrient replete in this sort of transition period while you're trying to get on track. So why not be nutrient replete now? It's not like we would say to someone with iron deficiency, don't take an iron supplement, just get your diet right, man. We would say, no, let's get you on an iron supplement. Let's get your iron levels back where they should be so that you can feel better, so your mood's better, so your cognition's better, because all of those things. And, a lot of people will dispute the effectiveness of multis. I get it, because the evidence for their effect on all-cause mortality is not fantastic. It's pretty equivocal, right? Doesn't really have much of an effect on how long you'll live, probably. But there are a lot of subtopics within that it does seem to have some pretty clear benefits. And one of those is mood and cognition, right? If your mood and cognition is better, you're probably going to stick to dietary changes or other lifestyle changes more effectively, right? There's also other stuff there where I think it can be a little bit ableist to some degree. I work with a lot of people with mental health challenges, that they're probably attracted to me because I have bipolar disorder. And so there are sort of ups and downs that come with that. Let's say I'm running a little bit hypomanic. The tendency I'll have is to not eat because I'll forget. I'm doing stuff, I'm researching, I'm writing, I'm talking to cool people on podcasts, all this kind of stuff, right? I'll just forget to eat. And if I didn't have that daily routine of supplementing, I might go quite a few days in a row without really getting what I require. Now, on those other days, I'm probably reaching sufficiency, but on balance, area under the curve, I'm not getting sufficiency for those various nutrients. So, it certainly helps with a lot of different outcomes where people have different behavioral patterns, and some of that can be based on, their various differences with neurodivergence or physical divergence or whatever.
Mhm. And just, I mean, even just, I mean, I don't work with one client who is just like not busy. Like most people are not just like, hey, I'm just sitting around and I got all day to like cook and get fresh food and go to the farmer's market. Like that's just, wow, we can romanticize that and want that. And if that is someone's life, like love that for you, right? But that is probably 0.001% of people. And I don't think that we should look at things like you said, a scoop of protein as a negative. Now, if someone is only consuming protein powder, could that be grounds for, hey, let's maybe have a discussion for, can we incorporate some other foods? Certainly. But I think that
Yeah.
it's just gotten so out of hand because there's been all this pushback, because there are these, holistic, which I know is probably like a kind of a like a touchy word, right? All of these people who push, hey, come to me and I'm going to give you a list of 500 supplements. And there are tons of amazing naturopathic type practitioners like in the space, like absolutely. But there are also others who give the same. I had two clients go to someone who specialized in all that, because they were dealing with a lot of issues, which it was hormonal, it was trauma, it was immune, like it was all, they had all the things, right? So they went to this practitioner and they had similar things but very different, right? And they both showed me the list of things that they were suggested, and while I am aware that there is likely an overlap of some of them, I was like, this is just a little convenient that they're all the same things, pretty much almost to the T. And I was
Yeah.
like, this is just lazy practitioner now saying you need to take $500 worth of these supplements, and like that's where I think that kind of got that bad name. But I don't think the answer is not taking a quality multi or greens and protein powder. Like
No,
if
well,
you're low on vitamin D, you're going to need to supplement with vitamin D, right? Like it's one of those things that probably, like, I'm just chronically always someone who needs to supplement that, even living in Florida and like going for a daily 20-minute walk. Like I just do not synthesize it that well.
mm,
So one of those things where, okay, I take this and it gets me to the level that I need to. I don't like beat myself up over that. If I forget one day, it's okay. It's not like, my life's falling apart, but it's just one of those things that I think we have to. Oh, I forgot my vitamin D. But I think it's one
yeah,
of those things that it's gotten so crazy because there are a handful of bad actors, but that does not mean that we throw away the entire like realm of micronutrient sufficiency and proper nutrition and maybe supplementation.
yeah. And unfortunately, I mean, there are a lot of pragmatic voices, but unfortunately, there is that dichotomy between what would be considered sort of orthodox, I guess, which is that, most supplements are worthless, and people take that to mean all supplements are worthless. And then the sort of green allopathic approach, which is come and see me, and I'm going to do a whole bunch of somewhat dubious testing, and I'm going to prescribe you $2,000 worth of supplements. There's obviously that pragmatic middle ground. And as I spoke about at the conference, we need to put the biggest blocks in place first. And that doesn't mean they're exclusionary. It's not like we would say, well, we might at some points, sometimes we might say, well, let's just focus on sleep for the next little while. But at other times it might be like, well, here's a few things we might do for sleep, and here's a couple of key interventions for nutrition. And there might be a coverage there, but we're focusing on the key things in terms of lifestyle habits and behaviors first, supporting that with supplements, but we're building up in a stepwise fashion. There are, I would say, and it's funny, right? Because I'm criticized from all angles. The low carb people say that I'm basically a traitor to low carb. The high carb people say I'm a crazy low carb person. I'm a registered naturopath and medical herbalist as well, right? So, but a lot of the naturopaths and medical herbalists say, oh, you're too scientific, and you're too orthodox and all this kind of stuff. And then the orthodoxy will see that I'm a naturopath and say, oh, you're obviously just a quack. You can't win, right? But the the challenge we have is that people overcomplicate, what is actually a relatively simple thing. And I'll put it this way. I've published some interesting case studies, I think, on like an interesting one was on a pediatric alopecia case. Alopecia areata, which is an autoimmune condition, autoimmune hair loss. And I really just made the case that we have quite a lot of research showing that there's an association between insufficiencies of key nutrients and autoimmune conditions, in particular alopecia areata. And I presented a case study in which a pediatric client improved very quickly, like within 3 months, grew all their hair back, pretty rad. So I got email. I continue to get emails. I get hundreds of emails from people around the world with kids who have alopecia. And I'm not pushing any particular crazy regimen or anything. It's just about getting the nutrient repletion. Because if you don't have the essentials, your immune system's not going to work properly. And the kickback from doctors to what I thought was a well-written, peer-reviewed, published case study was quite interesting because, you receive DMs from doctors saying nutrition's got no role to play in autoimmune conditions. Really? Well, I presented a whole bunch of research and there's a whole lot more because in a case study, you can only put 20 references. Or they'll say things like, it's just a natural cycle of relapse and remission. As I said in the paper, it could have been a natural cycle of relapse and remission. It could have been placebo. It could have been a coincidence, all these caveats you put in your limitations, obviously. But we consistently see when people reach nutrient sufficiency, they have better health outcomes. And that shouldn't be rocket science. Like this shouldn't require someone to go through, put themselves through mental loops because essential nutrients are essential. And if you're not taking in enough, you've got to do something about it. And if we can do that very simply, with some simple behavioral changes, some simple nutritional changes, maybe some supportive nutrition, in my experience, that takes care of 99.9% recurring problems without the need to go and do, somewhat dubious functional testing or to take thousands and thousands of dollars worth of supplements. Now, there could be rationale for other supplements. And I think, mucking around with supplements, experimenting, I find it fun. It's cool, whatever. There are some things we take because they give us particular benefit. I like lion's mane. I think it's rad. I think it's cool. I like MCTs because I did my master's on them. I think they're rad, but I'm not necessarily going to suggest those to every person because they're kind of the second step or the third step or the fourth step. So at that baseline, I would usually just consider a multi fish oil, maybe protein powder if they need it. That's the foundation generally from my point of view. The next step would be things that can help to support nutrition when people consistently undershoot, or like in your case, when they're not reaching true sufficiency levels through normal diet and lifestyle. So vitamin D, magnesium are often key ones there. Then we start getting into the nitty gritty, whether it's either creatine probably comes pretty early because that's a supported ergogen. But then you can get into all the other fancy stuff that is just fun.
Yeah, and I think that's a great, I think it's good to be like, hey, we like lion's mane is rad. You know what I mean? Like nootropics and things like that, like super interesting, right? Does everybody need that? No, but does that mean that like they don't probably need the other basics? Like that shouldn't even be, I don't think we should separate those two things as different discussions. You know what I mean? Because again, something like a fish oil, I do not know many people who are hitting, the appropriate EPA and DHA ratios without that. They're just not, like most people's diets do not include enough of the foods that would get you there, and that's whether it's access, because that's like those foods are expensive, like it's access, it's taste, it's, you can bulk prep, like chicken and steaks a little bit easier, a lot of times with fish and things, you're not going to do that, right? So there's so many layers to that. So I think that it's so important to take all of that into consideration. I love how you put that into like a hierarchy. So kind of changing a little bit, but I love this term that you use, psychoneurophysiology. I just love that term. So please define what that means to you or just in general. And let's talk about that.
Now, I don't know if that term was used previous to when I started using it. I don't know
I don't
whether I
know,
coined
but
it or not. I would suspect I didn't. But really, to me, it was a way of describing that continuum, which is bidirectional between, the psyche, the emotions, so our psychological state, our emotional state, and the body. So in effect, it's mind body. In the truest sense, it's the real root of psychosoma, but unfortunately, people think psychosomatic just means it's all in your head and it's not real. So it was a way of sort of describing that a little bit better because we can't really pin down sometimes exactly what is happening or where it's happening. Like pain's a really good example. What are the true causes of pain? There are a lot of theories and there's a lot of mechanism and function that people now know, but a lot of it is still very undefined. And there are a lot of outliers and a lot of discrepancies in how we sort of see pain. As I think we might have discussed at the SNA conference, the research on low back pain is really interesting because there's not strong associations between pathologies of the spine and chronic low back pain. Now, obviously, back pain is not an area I'm an expert in. I'm not a physiotherapist, but it is something we looked into a lot when I was studying mind-body healthcare. So I did my original postgrad in mind-body healthcare because it's such an interesting area, because the greater associations tend to be with psychosocial factors. And I think that going forward, the mind-body link and how the body affects the mind and vice versa is going to be one of those areas of medicine that is going to become increasingly more important, because we simply cannot, I mean, even if it's just in terms of behaviors like we've been talking about, the psychosocial component of our lives is probably far more important than physiological drivers. This is an aside, it's a completely random example, but I had a person come up to me at a fitness conference and said, I can tell you exactly how many grams of carbohydrates we eat per day. It's like, wow, how can you do that? I said, well, we've got this gene test and we can test your salivary amylase copy number variant. Right? That's the genetic marker for your carb tolerance. And that's interesting, because we actually abandoned research in that area because in the pilot, it wasn't a pilot trial, but in the pilot work we were doing with a medical clinic, there was nothing there. Right? It's one of those things where that marker does have some associations with obesity, and it does have some it certainly has associations with traditional diets. So people with high carb diets typically have higher, people who have traditionally had high carb diets, peoples who have traditionally had high carb diets have higher AMY1 copy number variants. So there are some of the associations there, but functionally, it doesn't actually make much effect because all the other stuff that people do just overwhelms it. And those are the bigger factors, right? But when we're looking even deeper into that whole mind-body side of things, it's not just about the psychosocial, it's about how our thoughts and, more importantly, our beliefs can have real effects within the body that are pretty spooky. And it starts to look pretty woo until you realize that there's pretty strong evidence for this stuff. And it all started with psychoneuroimmunology, or a lot of the actual legitimate research started in that space, because they were able to elicit immunological dysfunctions and immunological collapses through stimuli. So, you can inject dogs originally with immunosuppressant drugs, and they would elicit an electric shock at the same time. They take away the immunosuppressant drug and start eliciting the electric shock, and these dogs experienced immune collapse, right? Which is, a lot of people say, well, that's just simple Pavlovian responses, but it goes beyond that, because people's immunological responses in that way, people thought were ingrained. But then people began to realize that they're not so much ingrained, they can also be patterned in. And we're starting to see this more and more now with, some of these ways that we think and believe affecting things within the body, like pain, and even if it's not a direct response, it has a great implication for coaching, because some of those self-limiting beliefs are probably the key drivers in self-sabotage, right? And that's massive, because we can override those things for a time, but not long, right? How many times has any coach, anyone listening in, started someone on a plan, they go, awesome on it for 2 to 3 weeks, and then boom, they're gone. They just drop off. Something happens and then it's broken. Well, the thing that's happened is possibly that we can use that inertia of willpower for a period of time, but you can't sustain that. Willpower is kind of a short-term thing. So unless we can ingrain the patterns that become habits very, very quickly, it's likely that self-sabotage rears its head. And what is self-sabotage? It's about keeping us safe. So if we've developed a belief in some way for some reason that being in like a bigger body, for example, is our safest state, we start to move away from that. What does the mind start to do? What do our cognitive processes start to do? They start to look for things in our environment that are going to help to put us back in our safe state. And I had an interesting discussion with a client. They said, this weird thing happened. It was about 2 weeks in. I went to a party and all I could see was the cake. Like it's like everything else was blurred and all I could see was this cake. Like, okay, well, would that usually happen? Like, no, that wouldn't happen. Obviously, we can't prove anything from that, but it appears fairly clear to me that they had started to move away from what their body-mind complex considered to be a safe place. And they were in an environment where, I know that that thing's going to help put me back in my safe place, which is to be in a bigger size. So, these things sort of spring up. And I think it's a very under-recognized element of the sort of self-sabotage aspect of things, which is massive when it comes to being able to implement health behaviors.
Oh my gosh, I love this discussion so much. I knew it was going to be fantastic. And it's one of those things that I started to I think a lot of people who have scientific minds, right, especially people who've gone through like traditional schooling, you are taught, like evidence is king, like this, you have to have all of this like concrete data, et cetera, kind of prevailing notions of things. So anything that falls outside of that is kind of that woo-woo or that, to, the spiritual, the new age spiritual things, all that, right? And I think what started to happen a few years ago for me is I just started to recognize patterns that I just couldn't avoid with people, right? And I was like, all right, a lot of the individuals that I'm working with who either have hormonal disruption and or, gut health dysfunction and or just like general higher inflammatory type responses who also seem to really struggle to maintain certain behaviors, they all have like some type of traumatic thing that once we get to it like is unresolved and like it just kind of like just shows up. And sometimes clients know that coming into coaching, but a lot of times they don't, right? So these things aren't even necessarily addressed when you first start working with someone because they don't even maybe know these things. And then as you start to work with them over time, I'm like, I just keep seeing these patterns. Like there has to be something here. And that's when I really started to kind of dig into these types of things in terms of, even from the smallest sense of like journaling and like meditative, just like breath work practices, right? Like people still think that that kind of stuff is just so out there and like new age. And I'm like, no, this is actually has fantastic stuff behind it. And when you think about it, all of the people who, if you ever watch interviews of like highly successful people, whether they're like athletes or business owners or whatever, they all have certain like traits and certain beliefs
Mm.
about themselves. And they all say similar things like, I had this vision. I already saw myself there. I was, whatever it might be. And you're like, okay, again, if there's some patterns that everybody who has these certain things has, there's something there, right? To like belief being so important. And belief either elevating people to the next level or holding them back. And I've dealt with that
Yeah.
myself. And that was something that I honestly never really recognized, but I was like, why do I keep ending up in certain spots? And I was like, oh, because I don't have the belief that I can actually like get above this. Like
Yeah.
this is this and this will continuously, no matter how hard I try, bring me back down until I actually start to work through this and not ignore it and think that I can just barrel through it with my willpower, you know what I mean? And like that's where other types of practices, I think that kind of dabble more into that mind body connection, or more into that, kind of again, holistic, naturopathic, however you want to label it. That's where that kind of stuff is so powerful. And I know that you used to, I believe we talked about this, you used to do hypnosis, correct? Is that right? Or
Yeah,
did
I
you?
studied Ericksonian hypnosis, so it's sort of a more not direct hypnosis, but it's more about a sort of passive hypnosis where you're
Hmm.
using your toning and intonation and things like that
Hmm.
to help the person, help suggest to the person certain things and
Hmm.
have them auto suggest certain things. And we use some other sort of techniques as well to try and have those belief breakthroughs.
Hmm.
Now, I'm straight up about the fact that I'm not always convinced that what I'm doing is evidence based.
Mhm.
in that particular realm. There is
Mhm.
evidence behind what I'm doing, but in terms of the intervention modalities, I'm certainly not convinced that they're unequivocally proven, but they are effective. And so it could just be placebo, but with this type of treatment, it's interesting because it's very hard to study in order to eliminate the placebo effect. Because what is the placebo effect? It's a mind-body effect. It's like suggestion, right? That's exactly what we're doing. And so if we're using like auto-suggestion techniques and someone has a breakthrough that allows them then to not reach for that cake every day, that's a positive. And I don't care how it worked. In the same way that, like I mentioned to you, a couple of clients that I've worked with, an athlete with a frozen hip and recognizes some trauma from their past, working with other practitioners as well so that I know I'm within scope, helping with some of those things, doing some mind body type interventions, and then boom, it frees up and the person's able to go on, take up that contract and earn well. Uh, I don't exactly care how it worked, and neither did they. So I think it's a little bit different in some respects to, because I hear this from naturopaths and homeopaths and others as well, is that, well, even if this supplement I'm providing is just a placebo, like even if this homeopathic is just a placebo, who cares because it works? In those cases, I'd say, well, no, that's not good enough because there are other things you could provide, supplements or herbal medicine or something else that would have not just the placebo effect, but a actual effect as well on top of that. Not an actual effect, but an additive effect on top of that. Whereas with this stuff, there's nothing really else that will help people to change their belief patterns. And the proof of the pudding's in the eating. If someone's belief patterns can change and then they're no longer self-sabotaging or they're not experiencing that adverse effect anymore, then it's all good. But we do know, again, there is evidence basis for this, because if we can elicit very clear physiological effects in animals through stimuli, you know, why would that not occur in humans? Why would not, stimuli associated with trauma bring up negative effects now? It does. We know it does. So are there ways to address that? Probably. And we need to continue to research more to understand it better. And unfortunately, I think there's a bit of a resistance to researching things that are considered a little bit strange. And to me, that's not science. You study things, and if they're complete BS and through replication, lots and lots of studies show it's BS, then we get rid of it. And I'm all for that because I'm a scientist. But if we start to see things, let's keep looking into it, and let's keep moving down that track.
Yeah, it's almost become, I
But,
think, undeniable at this point that there's positives there.
oh yeah, and you mentioned meditation, right? It was, people like John Kabat-Zinn and others who really, I guess, founded meditation within medicine because they made it very medicalized. Mindfulness-based stress reduction, loads of studies on it. Everyone knows it's effective for reducing stress and having other positive outcomes. They had to sort of move it into the evidence-based realm to have it be accepted. When Joe talked about a lot of the sort of non-diet interventions not really being that effective, I brought up, the meta on meditation and mindfulness, which showed that, well, actually, in that case, that particular non-diet intervention is really effective for helping people improve health markers and reduce body fat. That's pretty cool. When people are more mindful, they tend to make better choices. That's something we should know as health or nutrition coaches or nutritionists, because having people be more aware, more present, more mindful, less stressed, all the things that go around there, they're going to make better choices. And that could be the key trigger for their change. And it doesn't always have to be about the food. It's often not about the food. It's the other stuff that's driving the patterns. I'm not surprised at all that we have increasing rates of obesity, diabetes, you know, non-communicable lifestyle diseases because we live in an environment that's not all that conducive to health, but more importantly, it's not conducive to happiness. That's actually the bigger thing, right? When all we're sort of told to do is be more productive, accumulate more, grind, hustle, work more, work harder, right? Even just thinking about that, all I want to do is sit on the couch and eat a muffin and watch Netflix. Right? I'm exhausted already, you know.
Have you heard of, do you know Cal Newport? He's an author.
Yes,
He
he writes about sort of the effects of social media and whatnot.
Yeah, I would say he writes just generally about media and the all the inputs that we have kind of in this digital world. He's written a lot of fantastic books, but he has a new one out called Slow Productivity, and he kind of speaks to that because it's not about being like because now we're having all these kind of movements that are trying to champion for like less work day or less, like the four-day work week and things like that, right? And he's like, I think that that could be a step in the right direction. However, that doesn't change the root cause of the problems, right? Just because
Yeah,
now you have 4 days doesn't change the fact that people are chronically distracted because they are trying to do too many things to be pseudo productive. They're not actually getting any work done. So you're feeling frazzled and you would feel that way if you had 1 day of work. You know what I mean? So it's
yeah,
you're not changing the actual like underlying inputs. And he just goes into all these really great examples of just how like so for example like say somebody comes up with like like a really big breakthrough or like some kind of an invention. They maybe didn't do that in a linear way, or maybe they didn't do that in a way that was quick, right? Nobody was like, hey, when you get the light bulb done, when are you going to get the like right? People were doing things on their own time. Didn't mean they weren't dedicating themselves very deeply to it, but it's just done in a way that actually shows real productivity and not just saying yes to everything and have all this micromanaging and having all these chats open and different things where people feel like they can't get anything done. So I would highly recommend. I'm still early on in the book, but highly recommend checking it out. Um, just because, again, like that's such a great point of it's not necessarily just the food, right? Like even
mm,
when someone is, and this is such a small nuance, but I always like to think of like when people talk about overeating, or people use the word binging maybe inappropriately, but overeating, binging, whatever someone says, it's never really about the food. It's more so about the mindset to me around it, right? Because you can
yeah,
sit down and have a high calorie, indulgent meal, but if you're there and you're very present and you fully made that choice to have that and you're enjoying it and you're around friends and family and you have no negative consequences in your mind about it, you're just, okay, great. Now I can move. I wake up the next day and I move on, right? Instead of
yeah,
you could binge on a protein bar, right? Because you could have all these negative thoughts about it. You could be trying to restrict, you could be going back and forth, having all these mental stressors around it. And it's really just like this protein bar. So it's not really about, to me, about the food. Obviously, yes, we can go into the conversation of, obviously total calories matter. I'm not trying to negate that. But in general, I think that there's so much of just like the mindset around like we need to be looking at that. It's not just about the food, right? It is the environment and our mindset just in our day to day with everything involved. And even just when it comes to restriction, when people are
yeah,
saying, like, yeah, I'm just like, I'm not having this right now, versus like, I can't have this. I'm on this plan and I have to restrict myself and I can't wait to be off of this horrible diet. Like, you're never going to be successful if that is how you are thinking. Like, there's 0% of people are successful long term when they think that way. You can hack it through a 12-week diet, but that's
yeah.
not going to be long-term success that you really want.
100%. And I think this speaks to the bigger topic that I talk about this a lot on various podcasts, and I talk about this a lot in workshops and conferences nowadays, is we really need to look at a bigger picture. And you brought up the ideas of efficiency, productivity, etc. There's a really cool quote from Peter Drucker, who was an management consultant, economist back in the day. He said efficiency is doing things right, effectiveness is doing the right things. And I think we misequate what we're doing nowadays with, and productivity is a measure of efficiency and economics, right? So we look at efficiency and productivity as being hallmarks of a successful process, not effectiveness. Because I could be really productive, I could be really efficient in a day and do all the wrong things and not really be effective. But because effectiveness is more of an ethical measure, ethics, in the old sense of what defines right action, how do we define what's effective for us? Well, we need to go beyond. We need to start asking, like I said at the conference, why? Why am I doing this? And I think in asking that question, we start to realize very quickly that we need to move beyond health. Not that health's not important, but health is part of the process. Health is the foundation. It's almost like one of the launching pads for living a better life. It's not an objectively desirable goal in and of itself. Because if it were, all the people who look fantastic on Instagram would be happy and successful and well balanced, and everything would be awesome. And we know that a lot of those people aren't. Some of them are. Maybe many of them are, but many of them also aren't. And so, I think we really need to reevaluate our own whys and what our, bigger life looks like, what our life of passion and purpose looks like. And I think we need to go bigger than that as well. We need to start looking at how our society engenders the actions we have, because I don't think it's enough. We need to do the things we need to do for our own health and happiness. It starts at home. But then in order to help people best, I don't think we can just leave it with being able to affect those few people that we can coach personally, or those tens or hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands that we can reach through our maybe writings or media presence or whatever. We need to be reaching those people who are not always easily to reach or cut through at the moment, because those are usually the most disenfranchised people in society. And those are the people that I never criticize for smoking, drinking too much, taking hard drugs, whatever, because I understand that those things are all their ways of coping in an environment that's not all that pleasant, right? And the only way I think we can do that is to really change our perspective. I'm getting on a soapbox here. I'll get off it soon. We need to change our perspective on what is most important. And I think happiness should become a key metric. Sounds weird. It sounds arbitrary. How would you measure it? Who knows? We need to work through all those issues, but I don't think we can continually just look at profitability or national income or productivity measures as being markers of success when people are probably having a shorter health span and poorer quality, mental health. Like in this country, we've got pretty poor mental health statistics. And we live in one of the safer, better developed, ostensibly, according to others, one of the best countries in the world to live in. And yet people are, depressed at really high rates. And we've got terrible suicide rates and all sorts of things that just don't seem to mesh with what people would see from the outside. That points to other things,
Yeah, that's actually pretty surprising to me, just because I've been, and I was able to actually really just see like how great it was there, and part of that is just because it's just a smaller place. Like things can operate differently with less people. How many people live in New Zealand? What, like 5 million?
5 million, yeah.
Maybe, yeah. I'm like, I think Florida has more than that. Like I think where I live has just even more than that.
Probably.
So there's just there's different positives that can come from that, but I still think it speaks to just like the human experience right now, right, is no matter where you are, right, even if it is for all intents and purposes like this great place to live, where you guys have amazing access to like nature and different things that a lot of places don't, right? So there's just, yeah, I think there's just a rewiring that needs to happen, and true connection and like connectedness needs to be coming back, but not necessarily in the way that we are doing it right now, because there is so little true connection between people. And I don't even think that it needs to be this like large scale thing where we all live in communes together. And I mean, for some people that definitely works. It usually looks like it doesn't work out, I'll be honest, but from all the documentaries I've seen. But like joking aside, like even going to the SNA event, right? Like that was, just a few days and we were all able to connect in that short period of time. But like being able to do that was so great to not only meet people like yourself and other people at the conference who I'd never met before, seeing people, like Eric and Joe and Barb and all them, and that I hadn't seen in a while, reconnecting that way. And that is one of those like fill your cup type things, right? But it's not like I think
Yeah,
people think that that has to be like every week. And it's like, no, 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 like you can do the difference between being really low to like feeling better, I think is smaller than people think.
yeah,
But they're thinking that it's so far away, like this is so far away from my life. I could never go to something like that. It's like, could you do something like that maybe like once a year? Right? Or could you do something like more connected, a small thing once a week? Like I think it's kind of like any kind of goals, right? And someone going back to like a physique related thing. Oh, I don't have the body that I want. The body that I want is so far away. I'm not even going to try because it's not there. But it's like if you did three small behaviors, you would probably feel a lot better. So even in the sense of like connectedness, I think there's so much that we can do that isn't even as dramatic or as large scale as I think people often equate it to.
yeah, yeah. It's push pull, and it's kind of like with within the body. I often talk about top down, bottom up. Neither one is going to be solely effective. So people think about physiological drivers of, say, you know, satiety, physiological drivers of hunger and all those types of things, versus the top down, which would be more like, conscious restriction and things like that. It's always going to be a combination. In the same way, I think when we're looking at behaviors and the bigger picture, to understand a little bit more about ourselves and what would really make us happy, in other words, our why and our ethos and values, that's sort of the thing that pulls us along. But also, like you alluded to just then, putting one foot in front of the other is critically important. Like one thing, I'll say two things here. One thing that I've found to be really helpful if I'm in a sort of depressive state, because obviously with bipolar, I'll go through ups and downs. Pretty good, pretty functional, pretty healthy, pretty happy, but it's just my tendency at times. One of the things I do is I've just got to leave the house every day, right? It's a tiny thing. I might even just be going to the letterbox, but it's one tiny thing, and it's enough just to start that cascade up. Um, the other element of this, I was on the radio a few years back talking about this, and someone rang in and said, well, what do you do when you're feeling really down? Like, what are the things you do to get back? I said, oh, we can talk about that, and I'll give you, a few of the things that I do, and they might help. But the more important thing is doubling down when I feel good, right? So when I'm feeling well, it's about being consistent with training, eating well, meditating, doing the things I know that are really good for me, because they're going to mean when you have the downs, you bounce more quickly, you come back more quickly, and maybe the down's not so low. So putting one foot in front of the other with some of those simple key lifestyle changes, or as a lot of people call it, linchpin actions. It might be as simple as making your bed every morning is enough to trigger you to have other positive lifestyle habits. Or for some people, it's flossing their teeth, like Tessa Bailecki, right? She says if she flosses her teeth in the morning, everything else is better. She does everything else better. Those are cool little things that help to push you along towards that place. So it's about having, both of those things working together. And I think when people do that, cool stuff happens. We start to realize that, you know what? I'm just doom scrolling here. I'm going to put that down. I'm going to go outside. It's just because you're that little bit more aware. Or, I'm looking on Temu for some shitty material thing that I really don't need. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with material things. If we need them, we love them, we enjoy them, cool. No problem. I'm not here to like get on anyone's case. But a lot of the stuff we buy we know that we don't necessarily need it because when we receive it, we realize that we didn't even enjoy it. It's kind of like, oh, I got this thing. Cool. What's the next thing, right? I think if people have a better understanding of their why and where they're heading, it just incidentally becomes a lot easier to realize that stuff in the moment. Like, I don't need that thing, right? One thing you mentioned before, which I just wanted to touch on, which is super interesting, is you've probably seen this, but people talk a lot about stress. Stress is not really defined in terms of its impact on us by the volume. It's more about the context. And the best example of that is it's not how much you work per se, it's your reward to work ratio. And this is where I think we can all start to have a big impact on not just our stress, but the stress of others. And the biggest driver of motivation is the belief that there's something more to work towards. So it's about community, social structure, support. So, for example, at the Institute, my company, we've got a real team focus, and it's about doing something bigger. But we also make sure everyone feels rewarded within that structure, and not just in terms of remuneration, but those things are really important too. So imagine if every company had a living wage minimum like we have. If you're straight out of college, you've never had a job before, I don't care, you're on a living wage. So that means at least you're going to be able to satisfy all of your needs and live a pretty decent life. But not only that, you're going to get a wage increase every year that beats inflation, right? Because you've got to be moving forward. I will never earn more than a particular metric over our lowest paid employee because I just don't think it's fair, right? All of that stuff goes into this sort of cohesion where people feel like, yeah, we're all in this together. And it drives really powerful outcomes. Again, I can completely relate to the person who's earning in New Zealand, let's say $23 an hour minimum wage, when the living wage is $26 an hour. They're always on the back foot. I can completely understand why, life's not that great. And the biggest enjoyment you have is to go and grab a dozen beers on a Friday and sink them all. Why not? Why wouldn't you do that?
Yeah, no, I love how I knew we were gonna weave so many different topics into here, and I'm like, I'm still finishing this now, going, what are we gonna title this? But I definitely would love to do a part two at some point because this was so great. But before we go, I do want you to touch on what the Holistic Performance Institute is because it's fantastic. So please, here is your moment to talk a little bit about it because I was recently introduced to it with, after learning about you at the conference and everything. So please go more into this.
So the Holistic Performance Institute is it's a tertiary institute. So it's basically an online college. We train people to be registered health coaches, accredited sports nutritionists, and registered clinical nutritionists. So our strength is really in our vocational accreditations because people can come out and actually register with credible organizations. But then, one of our other strengths is that, we're called the Holistic Performance Institute and we get a bit of flack for that. But I don't care because we're using holistic in its appropriate sense, which is to look at the whole person and their whole environment and all of the things that might benefit that person. But we're scientists. Our motto is Scientia me vocat, which means knowledge compels me, knowledge draws me, right? Knowledge calls to me. And that's because we take a scientific approach, so everything is consummately evidence-based. And, you look at our contributors, Dr. Eric Helms, Dr. Mickey Willardon, Dr. Shreda Madella, these are all people who are at the top of their fields and they're all known as consummate scientists, but they're all also, consummate practitioners and holistic practitioners. I know Eric may not consider himself holistic, and he probably actually does, but they all are because they are nuanced and pragmatic. So yeah, that's what we do at the Institute.
Yeah, I love that. And that people in the States also that works, right? Like in terms of the accreditation, correct? Or is it
Yeah,
different?
particularly for the obviously with clinical nutrition, it differs state by state. So people need to check with their own sort of regulatory bodies, but with sports nutrition, the SNA is active in the States.
Mhm.
And so our sports nutrition graduates can register with the SNA. Health coach graduates, I think, would be able to register in the States just through equivalent education. But if anyone was interested in that and wanted to contact us and talk about it, we could work through it with them.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think there's this new phase of a lot of people who either, went to college for maybe different things or didn't go to college and are in a position where they want to further their education, but don't necessarily either want to go back to school or maybe can't afford that or whatever it might be, right? There's just different limitations. I think that there's going to be such a new wave of institutes like you guys and SNA and these different companies that I think are really going to provide different opportunities that were just not existent before. And I
Yeah.
think that that's really cool because academia is not for everyone, and I don't think it's necessary for everyone either. Just truthfully, even though I love it, like I don't think that it's required for everybody, and I think that having other options is definitely like the way forward for our space
Yeah.
because it's too long. I feel like it's either been gatekeeping or just like, yeah, just get a certification you study 2 weeks for and you're fine. Like there's again, where is the middle ground here? Right? There's gotta be something. So I will definitely link that up in the show notes. And then if anybody has any questions, they can definitely reach out to you guys. So thank you so much for coming on. This was a fantastic discussion. Is there anywhere outside of, again, the website that you would want to direct people to, your own platforms or something else, drop it here.
I'm pretty much just the institute at the moment, so it's holisticperformance.institute is the place to find me.
Awesome. Well, thank you once again for coming on the show. And for all of you guys tuning in, we will be back next week. So talk to you guys then.